Welcome, everyone. Very excited to kick off our Inside the SOC series. This is our Blackpoint threat briefing that we're going to be doing every month. Really excited to kick this off. Got a great panel of speakers here today with us. We're really excited to kind of dive into, going over the things that the SOC is seeing and the things that, are constantly plaguing our MSP partners kind of throughout the landscape. So my name is Jason Barnheiser. I am the Director of Threat Operations here at Blackpoint Cyber. I am joined by Jason Rathbun. He is our Technical Director of Threat Operations. I'm also joined by Sam Decker. He is our Threat Intel Engineer. And then I'm finally, last but not least, joined by Nevin Beal. He is our Principal MDR Analyst. So all of us are very excited to kind of do this presentation today, show you all what we're seeing on the front lines, and give you all some actionable intel and real-world examples, so that way you can take those back and operationalize those internally as well. Kicking off, I did want to kind of cover a lot of the things that we're currently seeing in the space, right? So the first thing that we're going to do is we'll do a little roundtable discussion around what's dominating initial access. From FakeCaptcha to SSL VPN Compromise, we're going to talk about what's dominating the scene across all the verticals that we monitor for initial access. Then I'll pass it over to Sam. Sam is going to do a deep dive into some of the evolving FakeCaptcha techniques we're seeing. This is kind of a huge topic internally for our SOC. We see these, FakeCaptcha style attacks day in and day out across all of our shifts and all of our verticals. So this is something that has been effectively used and is able to kind of wreak havoc on local businesses. It keeps a lot of our partners up at night when, they're working on these different types of things because of the social engineering aspect. And then last but not least, we'll turn it over to Nevin. Nevin's got a cool kind of deep dive on a ScreenConnect cloud breach. We're always talking about like rogue RMM and things like that. But what happens when you have a cloud level breach of your own tenant and what that could look like as initial access and persistence on a network? And then after we get done covering these three topics, we'll really kind of deep dive into, some responses and actions that you all can take to help prevent these types of things in your environments as well. So to kick us off, initial access and compromise, aka what's hot right now. I know the big one that we already talked about is FakeCaptcha, right? I really see this as like social engineering for the masses, leveraged by threat actors, has a great way of initiating a compromise on an endpoint. So I think this is kind of the first thing we can talk about, guys. And Sam, I think I'll pitch this over to you first. What are we seeing in the FakeCaptcha space, and how is it impacting our MSP partners?
Yeah, so I think we've been talking about this for like the past year pretty much, and it's really kind of at its core. I think there really hasn't been too much that's changed significantly. It's really just been like what lull bins are they using as that first stage to pull down their next stage? How many layers of obfuscation are they using? What kind of malware are they dropping? But like at its core, the actual clear fake technique and campaign, there a lot of them, I checked a few out, when I see them, a lot of them are still using the same kind of like ether hiding techniques to hold the malicious code that's presenting the actual FakeCaptcha prompt. So like that portion of things really hasn't changed, and the prompts themselves haven't changed too much either from what I'm aware. It's really just like how many different layers can they add on top to make it harder to catch and easier to slip by.
Yeah. And Jason, we're detecting this in quite a few different ways. So do you want to talk about how detection engineering's taken a bit of an approach to FakeCaptcha and how we're able to protect a lot of our partners from this?
Yeah, definitely. We were seeing these kind of as they started like being utilized more by threat actors in the very beginning, because one of the ways that we set up our detections is more so around like the tradecraft than that specific tactic, right? So this can help with catching 0 days and such too, but essentially what we're looking at is in these scenarios, it's like living off the land binaries that they like to utilize, because their goal is essentially getting the victim into the run option where they can run code on the system. And in order to do that, they need to utilize binaries that are already on the system, right? Like PowerShell, MSHTA, command prompt. They're trying to use these in ways to where it'll reach out, grab a stage, and then actually try and accomplish the goals that they want. But we're seeing things like MSHTA, WScript, PowerShell. And we already have rules around these types of things because kind of the same thing, right? They know that if they can get you to run PowerShell, it's something that's on every Windows machine. Same for MSHTA and WScript. It can be used to run JavaScript and such natively on Windows without having to bring your own kind of like compiler in and such, right? So that's what we're seeing a lot. And we've created detections around like encoded PowerShell, obfuscated PowerShell. We've even targeted ones more specifically to fake CAPTCHA chains that we've seen, whether that's around them trying to add comments to the end of it so that the user only sees the comment and not the code they're executing when they put it in. But overall, right, user execution is something that we've seen a pretty large rise in, especially with fake CAPTCHA being something that feels very familiar to users nowadays in terms of like filling out captchas when there's browsing the internet.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I know when this first came out, I made the joke, like, you know, how when a CAPTCHA really pops up, it's like, select the number of, stoplights in the image, right? And I fail those all the time. And I'm like, ugh, like maybe I'm a robot, right? But like with fake CAPTCHA, it's easy, right? Like Control C, Control V, that kind of thing. And like I can pass those all day long. So I think the ease of access plus social engineering component of this is really interesting. And I know Sam's going to dive into that a little bit further as well. So fake CAPTCHA, big one, right? Like that's probably the top thing that we're seeing across, all the verticals and things like that. Another really big one that we see though is SSL VPN compromise, right? You think of this as like your remote front door to the organization, but the attacker can walk right through them as well, right? So we see a lot of this SSL VPN compromise where these things are externally hosted. Anyone has the ability to come across these things and see them. And then, the threat actor is then, leveraging weak credentials, default credentials, or compromised credentials in order to log in and gain direct access to the environment. So Nevin, my question to you here is why is this so important, right? I know threat actors can gain a lot of different methods of initial access to an environment, but what specifically about like an SSL VPN compromise gives them additional access and persistence that maybe some of the other, malware-based implants and rats don't give them?
Absolutely. It depends on sort of the mindset of the attacker. A good example is, or a good analogy for these SSL VPNs are like a fence gate. So for threat actors, they're a way to walk into the internal network, but again, it's still an access for all users. So when the user's when the threat actor authenticates with the compromised credentials of the user, gets on the SSL VPN, depending on how the network is set up. If it's a flat network, a lot of times what we're seeing in these breaches is they're hitting these crown jewels right away. So you'll have the SSL VPN compromise. The threat actor will say, hey, I'm on the SSL VPN. What can I touch from the VPN? And then they go forth, start touching the domain controllers, getting on the hypervisors, things that have imminent value within the network. For persistence, we worked one recently where the threat actor logged in as an administrator, so compromised administrator credentials, and they start messing with the configuration values for the SSL VPN. So a good one is setting like the SSL session timeout to 0 so they don't have to re-authenticate. They're also dropping tools on disk. So once they have the SSL VPN access, they start spraying and praying, see what devices they can access. And then once they have those sort of in scope, they go forth with dropping your typical RMMs and or adding some form of persistence, whether it's custom malware, rats, backdoors, things of that nature. But again, at the end of the day, it's just a form of legitimate network access that if you're not monitoring it too closely or taking in the contextual clues of like, hey, is this user supposed to be logging in at this type of day? Is this user supposed to be authenticating or executing from XYZ region? They can quickly slip past as just legitimate user traffic.
Yeah. Awesome. And then I think that comes down to like the third and kind of final big thing that we're seeing right now is rogue RMM abuse, right? Remote management and monitoring tools that are commonly leveraged by a lot of our partners are now being leveraged by threat actors as well, giving them that kind of like persistence and communication capability, which is, great for our partners to be able to remotely manage and monitor devices. But for the threat actor, it basically gives them the exact same capabilities, right? So I'll open this back up to you again, Nevin, around like these rogue RMM toolings and things like that we're seeing. Why is this such a popular, use case for threat actors, and why is it so successful?
Yeah, I'd say it boils down to two main reasons. The first is these are what we like to classify as shadow IT tools. So a lot of times, if you don't know your specific landscape of your customer environment or your environment itself, it's very hard to pinpoint down like, hey, this is a rogue RMM compared to a legitimate RMM. In other words, if they're leveraging legitimate tools for illicit access into your network, if you don't have application control or anything looking for these actual illicit tools executing in the network, they can quickly sort of fly by as legitimate due to the nature they are legitimate tools just being abused for illicit purposes. The other aspect is a lot of these rogue RMMs have like free trial periods. So a bunch of the big name companies, I'm not going to drop names, but a bunch of them have like 14-day trial periods. And these trial periods are they get a instance in the cloud. They have access to the RMM itself where they can start deploying it on host and then connect to those hosts via the cloud instance. Again, you can use illicit credentials, illicit card information, things of that nature. If I remember correctly, some of these fake or free trials don't even require a credit card. They just require a name and email to start access. Again, that just provides more power to the threat actor where, hey, I just need to provide them a junk email, a name, a phone number, things of that nature to gain access to this free trial RMM platform. And then using that free trial RMM platform, they then start phishing users, getting users to actually install them in XYZ like social engineering vector. And once that installed, they use the free trial to start deploying like on-prem versions that they host on VPSs throughout the world.
It's like C2 with an easy button, right?
Yeah,
Comes with
absolutely.
defense evasion.
Yeah,
I think
also
that's huge,
defense
too.
evasion.
From the threat actor perspective and from the MSP perspective too, like a lot of MSPs will use cloud hosted ScreenConnect instances. So when you go to contain these instances, like a lot of the times when we see rogue RMMs and they're using like, fake tech dot, run or whatever as their domain, like you can block that domain and prevent C2 callouts. But like if they're using like a free trial, you can't block the ScreenConnect, legitimate ScreenConnect infrastructure, especially if you use like already use cloud hosted ScreenConnect, you're going to like impact all of your customers. So
yeah, awesome. Yeah, so that's kind of like what we're seeing right now. Externally, what's kind of hot, what's really being leveraged by threat actors for that initial access piece. But we do want to go, a step further as well and kind of do a little bit of a deep dive, right? So for Sam, we've got some great capabilities here that we've been able to do a lot of deep dives around FakeCaptcha. So let's talk a little bit more about why end users still like to press the Windows plus R key and what that really means for our partners.
yeah, I think, and this is like one of the things I wanted to touch on and I didn't earlier, but you can see here, this is a prompt that I pulled off of a FakeCaptcha incident from last week. And it's using all of the legitimate Cloudflare assets. It's like one-to-one mirror of the Cloudflare CAPTCHA. Obviously besides the prompt, because Cloudflare doesn't tell you to press the Windows and R key, but even everything down to the animations of like the loading icon and everything, it's all ripped from a legitimate Cloudflare CAPTCHA. So that kind of leans into that familiarity aspect of like users are accustomed to seeing these kind of things, especially like these prompts, the page looks exactly familiar, to another Cloudflare CAPTCHA. And so it kind of like eases their suspicion right off the bat before they're even presented with the prompt, right? And you go click the button, it does the Cloudflare animation, like the circle, the green dots that are circling, like everything looks like a legitimate Cloudflare CAPTCHA. And I think there was something Jason touched on earlier, right? With like the picking out the stop signs. Like sometimes you have to sit through and you have to do that 5, 6, 7 times, and you're like, it was like, am I actually a human? And
crosswalks get me every time.
yeah, or the motorcycles. I hate the motorcycles.
Bosses.
It's like when it's like there's like a little sliver on one of the boxes, and it's like, well,
Yep.
it's kind of on that square, but I don't know.
Yeah.
And it's like it's refreshing to see sometimes, and you may know this too. Like sometimes you see ones where they're a lot easier, where it's like, oh, pick the 2 shapes that are the same, and it's like, oh, I could do that. That's easy. And so this is kind of the same thing. It's like, oh yeah, I can do these 3 steps where I don't even have to like do anything. And I think Jason Rathman, you mentioned it too. Like a lot of them will tail on to the end. They'll add a ton of white space, like trailing white spaces, and then like a code comment. It says like, verification complete, ID, whatever, some bogus numbers and letters. And it kind of just leans into that like, oh, this is a legitimate, prompt. And from a user perspective, a lot of the time they don't understand what they're doing. A typical, user in accounting is not going to open the Windows run dialog box ever. So they've probably never seen that. They really don't know what that does, what it means. And it's so quick and effortless that like by the time, most of the time they're running these and the window gets minimized instantly. So from the user perspective, we very often actually see the users run these multiple times because it's so quick and they can't tell if anything happened or not. They're like, oh, did this work? I don't know. And I would say 9 times out of 10, the user runs it more than once. That's just like spitball estimate, but I feel like it's very often that the users are running it 2, 3, 4 times just because they're like, oh, I didn't see anything happen. Like, I don't know if this works. And, the last point there is like the trust aspect of a lot of times, right? These are all like coming from compromised WordPress sites. They're navigating to a legitimate site they've been to before. They expect to be there. A lot of times we'll see like one of what I saw recently was like a local mall's website. So it's like that you've been to that site before. You expect there to be legitimate content on there. And if the WordPress is compromised and presenting these CAPTCHA prompts, you're already trusting where you're at, right? Most of the time they won't present these immediately on site load. They let you get to the site first, and then when you reload and navigate to a second page on the site is when they'll present that prompt. And so you already have that trust of like, oh, I know this website, I've been here before. This is the Tampa Mall, for example, and now I'm going to go look at their directory, and I have to verify I'm human before I go do that. So I think all of those is really
where they like watering hole the company's own website, right? And then that's a good way to go from, you just compromise the cloud and whether that's WordPress, etc., that they're using to manage their website, and then you can host this on it, and then you get the employees navigating to the site that they're used to, and it just looks like Cloudflare is now prompting them with something that they don't typically get, but they've seen it in other places, right?
Exactly. Yeah, I don't know if you had anything to add, Nevin. I feel like those 3 things are really the ones that I wanted to hammer home is like what makes this so dangerous, and they just keep getting again. This formula really hasn't changed.
Yeah, I'd say nothing's changed. The only thing to add on to Jason, outside of just compromising their own company's websites, we've also seen them compromise like trusted sites leveraged for like training. So new hires for different companies are onboarding, they're all going to this training site, and instead of focusing on like, hey, I'm going to pop the company's website, they're focusing on the bigger picture of, okay, outside of training for XYZ company, the website that's leveraged for training is probably used for like scaling the aspect of these breaches for the deployments of rats. Because again, it's just like an economies of scale mindset. Is the name of the game is how many of these remote access Trojan stealers can I deploy efficiently and quickly before my infrastructure is taken down from the compromised site.
Awesome. Sam, I think that leads us into like some of the ways they're involving the back end of this, right? Because, we are finding ways to creatively detect these things. So, threat actors will always find that next LOL bin to be able to leverage, or, some sort of unique system to leverage in order to perpetuate these types of attacks and be able to get around defense. So we recently wrote a blog on this, but I did want to kind of be able to go over this live a little bit around how they're using, some of these things to continue these types of attacks and evolve these attacks overall.
Yeah, and this is a really good kind of like segue, because from what we were talking about of like, we've been dealing with this for over a year now. And so there's a lot of companies are accustomed to like the typical process tree. All of these will spawn from Explorer because it's user initiated. So, looking for like Explorer to PowerShell to something else, or Explorer to, Mushta to something else, like those kind of process tree lineages are what people are typically looking for. So the threat actors are really just trying to alter those. We've seen them like recently use tools that like aren't typically run in environments, such as like Finger was one of the ones that we saw recently that they were starting to use. We've seen like DNS lookups being done to like, they're hosting the second stage payload in like the text record of the DNS like lookup, I believe is how that one works. And then this one, which we wrote the blog on, is for this Microsoft application v script, which is I believe it's used to like publish. It's required to be enabled, and it's used in enterprise environments, I think strictly, which is one of the things that makes it so interesting. But it's used to like publish and manage like virtualized applications within an enterprise. And so in this case, you can use it just to run PowerShell. So, typically it has legitimate use. In this case, you can see they're just calling it with WScript, and then they're providing a PowerShell script. And right below that, it gets spawned in PowerShell. So it's a neat way to kind of bypass that like typical process lineage detection logic of like Explorer to PowerShell to whatever by just like sticking WScript in the middle there. And, AppV is like attempts to look legitimate, kind of like blends into system activity. It's not something people see a lot. And I think one of the things I found most interesting about this one is that like AppV is not present on a lot of hosts. It requires like Windows like enterprise licenses. So when I was going to like do a lot of my analysis on this, I have like a throwaway Windows box that's not a Windows enterprise, doesn't have a Windows enterprise license, and so I didn't have the AppV scripts, and so I couldn't run it. And I don't know if I'm giving them too much credit and like that it's intentional or not, but I'd like to think that that's kind of an advantage of this one is like a lot of sandbox environments are not going to have Windows Enterprise licenses on those boxes. And so the payload's just not going to run, which I found pretty interesting. I don't, again, I might be giving them too much credit, but I think there's probably something to that.
Yeah, and when you think about it from a threat actor's perspective, they cast a very wide net typically. And one of the things that they have to do is filter through based on the information given to them, whether that's domain, privileges, CPUs, RAM, on what is actually a target, right? So this is a good example of an easy way to filter to, well, this means that they have Windows Enterprise, right? And like Sam mentioned, maybe they don't know they're doing that and they know that this is a little bit in some scenarios, but it does help them filter down to better targets if they're looking to cause like financial damage to enterprises.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's a great point.
Awesome. Well, coming from that, right? Like we want to kind of look at a little bit of like what this looks like here internally at Blackpoint, right? Like where do we kind of look at some of this stuff and see these different things? So we've got a little bit of an attack chain here, right, Sam? So do you want to kind of walk us through a little bit of what a common attack chain for FakeCaptcha looks like and kind of where we come in and detect, respond, and contain?
Yeah, so these all happen, all these steps are happening like almost simultaneously. So once the user runs that command, that first step is them like getting that prompt that we showed and they're pasting that command in, and that appv script is being run immediately. That PowerShell spawning is, like within a second. And all of that chains, typically a lot of these will rely on like in-memory techniques. So it will pull down another payload with, like invoke web requests or, get content, well, any kind of like applets or, they'll use curl, whatever, and they'll run that in memory reflectively rather than like pulling down a script that sits on disk. And the reason they do that is because it creates less artifacts, right? So from an MSP perspective, if you're looking at the host, they may have run this and you're like, oh well, I don't see any malicious files that were downloaded. And it's like, well, it's all happening in memory. That process runs and it just sits there. So in this case, typically we'll see a few extra chains after that first stage where they're pulling down reflectively additional stages. And part of that is to kind of like muddy the process lineage. So it's a little bit more difficult to see what's going on and what's happening. For this one, we saw the PowerShell that they actually called out to a Google Calendar meeting. And it was like the description field of that Google Calendar meeting. It had an additional code stage that was also run in memory, which ultimately deployed Amatera Stealer. But I think one of the things we've seen them do a lot, and the Google Calendar meeting is kind of like one iteration of that. We've seen them use like other legitimate services that they can kind of rely on to like bulletproof host their payloads. So it's kind of like ether hiding in a sense, but for later in the chain, right? Ether hiding relies on like using the blockchain to store the initial FakeCaptcha code that like, the actual web content. And so we'll see them use things like Steam profiles is one that we see them use a lot, where like the Steam username, they just change the username and it has like a domain that they can call out to. And from a threat actor perspective, what it allows them to do is, they have to change these domains often like multiple times a day. And so when they do that, they don't want to have to go and redeploy all of their payloads. So if they set stage one to always refer to, like a variable that's retrieved from some domain or some dead drop, right? In this case, like a Google Calendar meeting, then all they have to do when they want to rotate their infrastructure is they just change the details of that meeting invite or the Steam profile or whatever, and they don't have to redeploy any payloads. Everything that they have in place is already working, and it just kind of like changes where it redirects to. So we see them do that a lot just because it's a lot easier for them, and also it's kind of like you're seeing a call out to like the Binance Smart Chain or Google Calendar or Steam or whatever, and you're not really like suspicious of that in a sense, right? Until you understand what that's doing. So where we come in is we see that initial execution, and our platform will detect on that immediately on the chain of events based on Jason Rathbun mentioned, we're really trying to detect more on like the behavior of what they're doing. So like pulling down additional payloads, how do they have to do that? Why would WScript be spawning PowerShell to call out to a URL? Like how frequently do those kind of things happen in sequence? Those kind of like behaviors, and then our analysts will investigate it, identify that this is a loader, and find all of the indicators. In this case, we were able to attribute the malware itself, to kind of like provide partners with the additional indicators, the command and controls that it would be reaching out to. Sometimes EDR will stop these things. A lot of the times it doesn't. I think that's one of the things we didn't really touch on yet, but a lot of the times, because of how many chains are happening in that process tree, right? You saw the WScript to PowerShell. EDR may look at it and it's not going to look at that process and evaluate it before it runs. Typically, EDR will run alongside it. Otherwise, that creates too much impact for a user. So what EDR typically does is it lets those processes run and it scans them simultaneously. And so by the time it is identifying, hey, this PowerShell is bad, it's already moved on 3 stages. And so they can kill that PowerShell, but it doesn't matter because it's already pulled down, the next stage from that Google Calendar meeting and is running that malware in memory. And we actually see that a lot where, a partner will have an AV integrated with us, and we'll also get an alert alongside something that we've alerted to. And one, it's either too late or it's saying, that it killed it and stopped the process when in fact we see the malware running. And so it's kind of like, you were a little too late to the punch kind of thing.
That's a good point. We see it sometimes step in at like the final stage, right? Like the network call out or maybe the final PowerShell. But then once they update their Google Calendar to serve it a new payload that bypasses that portion, it's going to go through, right? So it's very important. That's what we're looking at, is all the stages from initial access and initial user execution to setting up persistence to creating run keys or whatever general persistence it does, to pulling the last stage and then eventually getting that command and control. And it has to kind of block all of those stages. So that's what we're confirming is, was this actually fully quarantined, or is there still persistence calling out to that Google Calendar that's going to get updated next week, right? And that was a really great point about like the Google Calendar and such, where with typical web hosted payloads, they might do like pastebin or such, where it's like a one-time thing, or they have to compromise a site or host their own site, and that site might get taken down. But Google Calendar, YouTube, Steam, these areas where they can kind of edit descriptions and update them on the fly that they know is going to bypass a firewall is very useful to them, unfortunately.
Yeah, and before we move on from FakeCaptcha, we've got a couple good questions that I did want to kind of talk about live on the call. So I'll open these to kind of everyone here, presenting. We've got 2 questions from Philip and Tristan. Is there something that an entity like Steam can do to make this harder for the bad actor? And Tristan, along the same lines, is like, is there an offensive approach to this, right? Like, how do you get this infrastructure taken down and report these things? Or is that something that's better left to kind of like FBI and law enforcement to take down from like those broader, ecosystems? I guess the question becomes, what can we do as MSPs and MDR providers to help remove some of this infrastructure, or is it even worth it?
I can start because I put a reply to Phillips in the chat. I think it's like companies like Steam and other platforms that are being abused, they do hunt down these IOCs and try and contain them. However, at the end of the day, the point I'm getting across, it's sort of like the Medusa, is you cut one head off and 3 more spawn. Threat actors are constantly building this infrastructure and sort of leveraging it and quickly changing it, and there's always these moving variables. So a lot of times when this is at scale, it's harder for these organizations to flag down the malicious abuse of it. Theoretically, could they put in place like a functionality where you can't have a domain within the username or something of that feature? Yes, but then say they fix that or patch that, the next day a threat actor could find another portion of the account or another aspect within the Steam profile, or however they're doing it in Steam, whether it's like a community discussion, things of that nature, to abuse for command and control. So again, they are always acting on trying to contain this, trying to flag it, things of that nature. However, it's a sort of, what's the analogy I'm trying to make? Is it cat and mouse? That's the one. Cat and mouse
like
game where it is like whack-a-mole. Is you find one, you cut one, hit one, and then 3 more pop up kind of scenario.
And a lot of the time you don't know if it's like a victim that they're utilizing to host this, or if it's like an account that they created, right? A lot of them are old hacked accounts that they're using, and they're modifying old video descriptions, or it's a compromised Steam account from years ago, right? So it kind of has that reliability already with Steam and several games, etc. So it can be very difficult to find things like this because they can hide it very like in the weeds. It could be some video from 10 years ago and they're just modifying the description, or they put a comment on a video somewhere, right? And they edit their own comment. So they do hide these things very like in depth in the platform to where you wouldn't find it really unless you're kind of combing through all the comments, all the posts, etc., and filtering for that type of thing, like domains being added and such.
Awesome.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point. Like, there's a million different ways they can do it, right? Like, I'm not going to sit here and give them ideas that they're not already doing, but like, you know, we can kind of like stop one of these. We can stop the Steam or the Google Calendar, and like, you know, Jason said, they're just going to go do like a YouTube comment or something else, and you know, they could encode it or whatever. Again, like I said, I'm not going to give them ideas, but there's going to be continued ways to do that. So it's like, you know, rather than like playing that kind of whack-a-mole game, I think it's like, well, how do you stop that from happening altogether, right? Like, how do you stop that call out from getting to that point initially, right? One of the things we always recommend is disabling the run box. Like, a lot of users don't need to ever press Windows and V, right, on their host to run anything. I know there are some legitimate applications that like do leverage that registry, but like, you know, you can disable that via group policy. And that's like one of the things we always recommend. You know, Sally in accounting doesn't need PowerShell kind of thing.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, moving on to, you know, kind of like our delivery layer evolving and what this means and kind of like overall how this is impacting our partners. You know, I open this up to kind of everyone as well. You know, what does this mean? And, you know, Nevin, for you specifically, I understand that, you know, we're getting ready to talk about ScreenConnect in the cloud. So like, what do you see as like the delivery layer evolution and as we move forward here?
Absolutely. For the delivery layer, a lot of times, I think the biggest thing to highlight on this slide is legitimate infrastructure. Within a couple slides ago, when Sam was going over the sync app via publishing, they were using JS Deliver and other legitimate CDNs. So threat actors are always finding ways to abuse legitimate platforms. A great example is like, what is it, the Internet Archive, where they're hosting or archiving malicious PNGs that have base64 encoded within the PNG, and that base64 is like a DLL that's then leveraged in a kill chain for deploying a rat or a stealer. So at the end of the day, the biggest sort of phrase I can emphasize for these campaigns is when there is a will, there is a way. So a lot of times with this legit infrastructure, they're finding ways to masquerade their malicious activity on legitimate platforms, whether that's Steam, whether that's like Google Calendar, Cloudflare, CDN hosting payloads, things of that nature. And again, another portion of that is the obfuscation aspect of things. Is a great example is the aliasing for PowerShell. So like calling get alias and then calling different aspects of like a I forget the technique, it's lol something. Loglob. So like a loglob for calling like IEX or IRM, or finding different ways to sort of break the norm of calling these different commandlets in PowerShell to download and execute payloads in memory. So at the end of the day, it's going to be a constant sort of chase. And again, when we're talking about the ScreenConnect aspect of things, threat actors it's not always an on-prem sort of breach or scenario for breaches. Now we're going to cloud, finding ways to pivot from cloud to on-prem if there's a hybrid environment, things of that nature, which will be touched on later with the ScreenConnect case study. But again, the infrastructure obfuscation, finding ways to execute via legitimate payloads or legitimate binaries on Windows, and then also gating it to make sure, like, hey, when security research like us trying to figure out what's going on, they make it a pain because we don't have the initial portion to follow the kill chain.
Yeah, I think that's a good kind of like segue into, you know, kind of like our next topic, right? Which is ScreenConnect, right? You know, leveraged by tons of MSPs and you know, it's a legitimate tool again, but it's being leveraged in a way that is not legitimate, right? So you want to talk a little bit about like this proverbial front door in the cloud that could give threat actors access to kind of like your entire house, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely. So ScreenConnect is a legitimate remote management and monitoring tool. I think that term for it is ConnectWise Automate, if I remember correctly, CWA.
Mhm.
I forget which one's the old and which one's the new. Threat actors frequently target in these RMM abuse due to the nature of it provides the full functionality of a RMM. So if they're able to get a rogue instance of ScreenConnect on, say, a user's workstation, they can upload payloads. A lot of times we see them executing open source rats, such as like async rat, things of that nature, to maintain persistent access on the host, or they tend to daisy chain RMMs as well. So ScreenConnect gets installed, they then execute ScreenConnect. What's unique with this breach in ScreenConnect Cloud is the threat actor was leveraging one for scale is MSP. So there's the abuse of the pre-established trust. So think of it as like, hey, if I'm compromising ScreenConnect Cloud and executing commands via the MSP ScreenConnect Cloud, those commands are typically not going to be as heavily scrutinized due to the nature of they're coming from a trusted source. Furthermore, the term living off the MSP is understanding why they're doing this. Is a lot of times for these MSPs, they have multiple tenants under one ScreenConnect Cloud instance. So when a threat actor compromises the ScreenConnect Cloud portion and can remotely execute on all of the tenants within that instance, instead of like, hey, I just have Stacy and accounting's workstation I have access to, they then have access to every workstation that has the instance for ScreenConnect Cloud installed onto it. So again, if you're thinking in the mind of the threat actor, if you're wanting to deploy ransomware, wanting to extort, steal data, things of that nature, the economy of scale is you now have so many more endpoints to laterally spread from, pivot from, things of that nature, which is why these RMMs in the cloud or cloud-hosted RMMs are such a big target, especially when they're tied to MSPs.
That's why it's important to protect like cloud and on-premise, right? Because if you're not protecting your authentications to ScreenConnect in the cloud, they can gain access to those on-premises machines via ScreenConnect, right? Like we've seen Intune be abused by a global administrator to push out Redline Stealer across all the endpoints. And then vice versa, right? Let's say you gain access to an admin's on-premise machine and that admin is signed into ScreenConnect. Then they have access to ScreenConnect via that too, right? So it can go bi-directionally in terms of like from cloud to on-premise, along with also if passwords are kind of reused from the Azure environment and in the cloud. That's one other pivot, but we've seen that become a more common trend to where if the cloud gets compromised or the on-premise side of things get compromised, they try and get to that other area.
Yeah. What is it? With great power comes great responsibility, right? Like, with this access that MSPs have to their end customers, that access is just as insightful for a threat actor. And, we talk about internally in a network, you have your keys to the kingdom, right? But then what about keys to the kingdom of the kingdoms, right? So like you get that additional attack chain and attack vector across multiple, environments now, which could lead to multiple, levels of extortion.
Yeah, and the last thing I would like to highlight on this slide is once they have access to the ScreenConnect Cloud hosted instance, they can remotely execute from it. The command they remotely executed is in that screenshot. So we can see this metalink.click, which is just a file hosting site, and they were downloading this WES1_e.exe. It is a NO installer. In other words, it's a installer file. And what's very unique about this portion of it is the mindset the threat actor had in setting up this campaign is we're going to breach the MSP's ScreenConnect Cloud instance in some shape or form. After gaining access to this, we're going to remotely execute a curl command out to download this binary and install it on these hosts. This binary is a ScreenConnect wrapper. In other words, it leverages the dependencies needed from legitimate ScreenConnect installs to be its own ScreenConnect. And that's a very unique aspect because at the end of the day, the threat actor knew that, hey, eventually the MSP or whoever owns this ScreenConnect Cloud instance, the hosted instance, is going to realize that the account's been compromised and they're going to kick them out. But by the time they've already ran these commands, they now have persistent access to all the hosts that this command was ran into or executed onto. And it's not even like a traditional rogue ScreenConnect instance. It's some other binary that's masquerading or pulling the necessary files to be its own ScreenConnect.
We've seen this a lot, right? It's like the Russian nesting doll effect, where it's like ScreenConnect is abused, it drops ScreenConnect drops AnyDesk drops a Terra, right? And then finally a payload gets dropped. And it's those various levels of persistence that they have to where, if ScreenConnect gets compromised and it gets removed from their access, well, now they still have AnyDesk and a Terra on the device to be able to continue to do what they need to do.
And we've seen that happen where ScreenConnect has cut off access, but then they still have splash to splash top remoting or whatever other tool they put on there to utilize.
Yeah, and this screenshot just showcases the actual malicious commands being ran from the cloud-hosted instance. We can see the compromised administrator account, the ScreenConnect account administrator, running those curl commands out to that metalink.click site to download that payload, and then that payload was also executed on the host. So again, bringing it back to the scale portion of it, this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 entries in a log file, with a log file that has over 200 lines. So that's the main reasoning why threat actors are also focusing on these cloud-hosted instances, because it's, hey, I have access to the keys of the kingdom. I can run this command over 200 hosts. I now have persistent access across 200 different devices across multiple companies, which for a working towards their action on objectives, it makes it a much more lucrative target than just hitting one host and having access to one host.
Yeah.
This is the ISS or ISI, I forget the portion of the file name. In other words, this is the installer script for the ScreenConnect wrapper. What's very interesting to take into account is we can see the files being downloaded, the registry keys being set, and then the actual run commands that are executing. It installed this as a service called Microsoft.NET Assembly Reference System Service. The install paths are also masquerading as legitimate, like, hey, this is a legitimate Windows binary within legitimate portions. In reality, this is just another mindset or methodology of the threat actor to try and blend in as quietly as possible. When this binary was ran, it was calling out to a VPS command and control server out of Italy. But again, thinking bigger picture is the multiple steps in this kill chain is, hey, I'm compromising the cloud-hosted ScreenConnect instance. I'm running a click or curl command using this instance to download a ScreenConnect wrapper, and then the wrapper is maintaining persistence on this host by a malicious service. But again, all the portions of this are focusing and blending in as legitimate activity. If commands are being executed via the MSP's instance, the wrapper is masquerading as a, hey, like a, I think it's the GAC, like legitimate GAC folder, masquerading as the GAC folder. So masquerading as legitimate Windows folder locations and file names. And then at the end of the day, it is creating a service that is also trying to masquerade as like, hey, I'm a legitimate .NET assembly reference system service, which is just, again, the methodology and mindset of, hey, how can we sort of maintain our cover while increasing the scale of this attack.
And when they're doing this, right, like you have to think also from their perspective, again, we touched on this a little bit. They're getting like high value targets, right? They're getting enterprises, access to enterprise workstations, likely all of the workstations and host in that enterprise, rather than like, with a FakeCaptcha campaign that can hit anybody. You can get some random user at home, which, like, realistically, a lot of the times the threat actors don't want access to just like a single person at home's workstation. They want access to like an enterprise so they can broker that. So with this, they're getting access to like every single enterprise that is managed by that MSP, right? Which is a lot higher value for them. It's a lot easier for them to move. And when they go to sell that access or broker it, they're giving access to like several hosts in the environment.
Yeah. So why does this matter beyond initial access? Like, I know we've talked a lot about initial access, but specifically for this, Nevin, like, why are we really wanting to make sure that our partners understand this particular attack chain?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's not opportunistic, as Sam was saying, with the fake captchas. This whole kill chain was designed for a specific purpose, to maintain covert access onto a wide variety of hosts for a long period of time. The main functionality was to blend in as a legitimate admin and then maintain admin level access to all these hosts without realizing. And the big phrase there on that slide is operate through the trusted or abuse what is known good. So again, they're not focusing on, hey, I'm trying to get the user to run a malicious command via the run dialog box. I'm not trying them to click a malicious file to pull down payloads. I just want them to operate normally, and I'm going to abuse the actual known good or the known trusted channel on between the MSP and the end client to start deploying payloads that are going to masquerade as legitimate purposes or legitimate files on the host. The other aspect of it is the rapid post-compromise scaling. So again, having access to these cloud-hosted instances allows the attackers to expand their reach across multiple domains. So not only are they targeting, say, XYZ vertical, they can be targeting healthcare, law, construction, all this in one through this aspect of attack. Also increase in tempo. So everything at the end of the day in this kill chain, when abusing these cloud hosted instances to rapidly deploy, everything gets scaled almost instantaneously. So instead of worrying about, hey, this one user workstation is infected, they're going to move laterally from this one workstation to the next, deploy ScreenConnect there, move to say a server and deploy ScreenConnect there. All the workstations or even the servers that have ScreenConnect deployed will have this sort of RAT deployed via the cloud hosted instance. And once it is deployed, the adversary already has that such high level access in the network and such far reach. Instead of starting at the very far left of the kill chain, they're probably like a step or two away from their action on objectives. Because at the end of the day, if they wanted to say push out ransomware, pull files, things of that nature, all it would just be logging into the cloud hosted instance or that wrapper instance that they're hosting and just pushing the file, pushing the payload via that method. Another big portion is the aspect or highlighting the delivery channel. It's modular, so it's consistent. If they want to, once they have that wrapper and they want to push out a different open source RAT, or say they want to change their campaign, they have the ability to do so. It's also resilient. So a lot of times we're not focusing on just one RMM being deployed with the wrapper being involved. It could be, hey, the wrapper gets installed, they then drop a custom payload on the host, or they start dropping other wrappers for different RMMs to maintain like a sort of full access to these hosts via different mechanisms in case they do get caught and kicked out.
Awesome. Yeah, well, that's a great kind of wrap up of what we're seeing there. But big things, right, are mitigation strategies for these things. I saw a couple, questions in the Q&A about like preventing these things and how can we better protect end clients and improve overall security posture. So some of these we've touched base on, right? With FakeCaptcha, where applicable, remove access to the Windows Run dialog box to prevent execution within that attack chain. If they can't control R, they can't control V, right? So like breaking some of those initial chains of attack by limiting the exposure for the user themselves as well. Also looking at like restricting PowerShell usage where applicable to break that chain of attack. Always want to remember kind of like that principle of least privilege, right? Somebody in a specific role may need PowerShell as a part of their role in their operations, but then you could have someone else within the company that doesn't need that. And it's just that capability reduction that you have there helps to kind of break these attack chains. And then similarly on like the SSL VPN side, right? One of the big things that we talked about there is those external facing login portals. Those are difficult because sometimes they're required, but making sure those get locked down, it's not a matter of when they will be found, or it's not a matter of if they will be found, it's a matter of when they will be found. So, it's one of those things where you want to make sure that we're locking down those login portals, making it token-based access, or at least, ensuring MFA and other strict controls are enforced there, because a lot of times what we see is initial access through those SSL VPNs. It's leveraged through default credentials, weak credentials, or reused credentials that have previously been compromised. And then I saw a question in the chat about this before Rogue, the Rogue RMM tooling aspect, enforcing some form of application control. Blackpoint, we have our own managed application control. There are other application controls as well, but ensuring that you lock those things down and don't allow them to be implemented in the environment, and making sure that you only have your approved RMM tooling is very important. We still have kind of like the capability for cloud exposure and things like that, but making sure that an end user can't get socially engineered to drop a rogue RMM tool is very important as a piece to that protection.
Keeping track of like what's installed too can be key. Like we pull all installed software and the versions of it per system that we protect. So for example, like when there's a vulnerability, we can query out and see what software people have running in that version range that's vulnerable. But that's another way to do it. If you don't have application control, you could utilize like your inventory software to take a look at new installs, especially if it's large. If you start seeing it get installed across multiple systems and you don't utilize that RMM, that could be cause for concern.
Yeah. Yeah, so open it up here to the rest of the crowd, right? Any other mitigation strategies that we haven't touched on regarding some of these major initial access vectors that we're seeing that could help our partners today?
Application control.
Doubling down
SSL
on app control.
I'll triple down on it. Yeah.
Yeah, triple down.
The SSL VPN one's a good point too, right? Because overall, like exposed services are a huge like risk. especially if you're not doing like patches and updates for them, or they don't automatically patch. Anytime there's a new patch or vulnerability, even if there aren't like proof of concept code out there to be utilized, threat actors will try and create their own proof of concepts to be able to start exploiting those, right? So whatever you can do, whether that's whitelisting certain IPs to be able to access your applications, putting them behind the VPN, or even using like a zero trust solution to be able to get to the network to utilize them, can be super useful, because 0 days too, right, can apply to different applications. And that's why we've built our detections in a way to that we can still alert on 0 days, because we're looking at certain tradecraft that comes from execution as a result of those 0 days, right? So we'll see like the IIS process start launching PowerShell or these other little bins, right? Just as an example. But I think it's a good point to showcase, like, we very commonly see SSL VPN be abused, but there's also a larger problem overall of services directly open to the internet without controls on them.
Yeah. Yeah, it's always, whenever we see a large uptick in scanning activity for SonicWall, FortiGate, something like that, all of us start to kind of sweat a little bit, because we're like, there's a big uptick in scanning, so we're wondering if a new CVE is getting ready to drop, or a new CVE drops and you immediately see that uptick in scanning, right? So it's very important to understand that, these things that are externally exposed are quickly acted upon when we have some form of proof of concept, which just means, whatever your patching strategy is, really make sure you're taking a look at some of these externally focused pieces and patching those as quickly as possible. Awesome. Any final comments from the team here? Sam, are you going to quadruple down on application control?
I could.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate everyone joining us today. That is all we had to cover today. Appreciate everyone that dropped something in on the QA as well. Once you're registered for this, after this webinar is completed, you will receive a recording as well. I also saw some comments regarding wanting the slide decks too, so we will look into that next time for everyone as well to make sure we can provide those. But greatly appreciate everyone spending some time with us, and greatly appreciate everyone that joined us today. And we look forward to talking to you all next month on another Inside the SOC webinar series. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.